When you really stop and think about the dollar, it's so much more than just money, right? Visually, it's got to be one of the most recognized brands on the entire planet. You could pull out a $20 bill anywhere in the world and people would instantly know what it is. But it's also this psychological thing. It's become this universal symbol for making it, for wealth, for power. So yeah, let's dive into this, because the dollar isn't just America's currency. It's this global empire that, one way or another, affects every single one of us.
And this quote, man, this just says it all. It was from U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally back in 1971. He was in a room with a bunch of European finance ministers, and they were all complaining about America's economic policies. And he just hits them with this line: "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." With one sentence, he laid out the whole theme of our story today, the incredible and, let's be honest, often controversial power the U.S. has because of its currency. It really is true. When the dollar sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold.
So how did we get to this point? Well, we're going to break this story down into 4 main acts. First, we're going to see how the dollar was basically born out of complete chaos in early America. Then we'll watch its coronation as the undisputed king of global finance. After that, we get to the really wild part, the story of what happened when it was unleashed from its golden anchor. And finally, we'll look at the situation today, where the dollar's throne is facing some serious challenges.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. I want you to picture early America. There was no single unified currency. It was a total mess, a monetary Wild West, if you will. And this chaotic free-for-all is what set the stage for the dollar we know today.
Okay, get ready for this number: 10,000. By the year 1860, that is roughly how many different kinds of dollars were floating around the United States. Seriously, you had notes from states, from thousands of different private banks, railroad companies, hotels, even local general stores were printing their own money. Can you even imagine going to buy groceries today and having to argue with the cashier about whether the money in your hand is actually real? It was nuts.
And as you can imagine, this situation was a counterfeiter's paradise. It was an absolute golden age for financial crime. But the really brilliant criminals, they didn't even waste their time trying to copy existing bills. Why would you? It was easier to just invent a fake bank, like the Bank of Omaha, even if you were in Philadelphia. Print up your own official-looking money and pass it off as legit. It was pure anarchy.
So eventually, this chaos just couldn't last. The whole thing started way back with the Continental currency to fund the Revolutionary War. Then you had that classic debate between Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong central bank, and Thomas Jefferson, who was terrified of it. Well, Jefferson's side more or less won, which gave us a weak system and led directly to that Wild West era. The real turning point, though, was the Civil War. The Union was running out of money to pay its soldiers. So in 1863, Abraham Lincoln did what had to be done. He created a single federal currency, the greenback, and for the very first time, America had one standard, trustworthy dollar.
Now let's jump forward into the 20th century, because this is where the dollar's role in the world is about to change dramatically. 2 devastating world wars had left the global economy in absolute ruins. The old European powers were broke, their currencies worthless. The world desperately needed a new financial system, and there was really only one country left standing, its economy booming and untouched by war, ready to take the lead.
And this is the moment of coronation. In 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to build a stable system that would prevent the kind of economic disaster that led to World War II. The solution they landed on? The US dollar. It was officially crowned the world's reserve currency, and it was backed by the largest stockpile of gold in human history. From that point on, all other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold. A new world order was born right there in that hotel.
Now, this created a situation with a very famous name: exorbitant privilege. You have to understand this concept. It basically means this: if any other country runs up a huge debt, they eventually run out of gold or other foreign currencies to pay their bills. But not the United States. America can pay for anything it buys from other countries simply by printing more of its own money, because its money is the one everyone else wants and uses. It is a financial superpower that no other country on Earth has.
But, as you can guess, not everyone loved this arrangement. As the U.S. started printing more and more dollars to pay for things like the Vietnam War, other countries got nervous. French President Charles de Gaulle was maybe the loudest critic. He saw this exorbitant privilege for exactly what it was and started demanding that France's dollars be converted back into solid gold, just like the Bretton Woods Agreement promised.
It got so tense that at one point he actually joked about sending a French warship to Fort Knox to pick up the gold personally. He was kind of joking, but not really. The pressure was building.
And all that pressure was building towards one of the most shocking moments in modern economic history. The Bretton Woods system was cracking under the strain, and something had to give. The entire world was about to learn that the rules of money they thought were set in stone could be torn up and thrown out overnight.
And then bam, August 15th, 1971. In a move that absolutely stunned the globe, President Richard Nixon went on TV and announced that he was temporarily closing the gold window. He was ending the dollar's convertibility to gold. Well, that temporary suspension is still in effect today. In one single evening, the Nixon Shock, as it's called, completely severed the dollar's last tie to gold. The Bretton Woods system was dead, and the world was thrown into a brand new and very uncertain era of floating currencies. What came next can only be described as a roller coaster. Without that gold anchor, the dollar's value went on a wild ride. First, it plunged. Then, to kill runaway inflation, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker cranked interest rates up to the stratosphere, which sent the dollar soaring. It got so strong that it started to break international trade, so the world's major powers literally had to meet at the Plaza Hotel in New York to collectively force its value down. And then it fell too far, so they had to meet again a couple of years later to prop it back up. It was just this chaotic, high-stakes global balancing act.
This brings us to a really critical moment in the late 1970s. The U.S. economy was an absolute mess. The dollar's value was at an all-time low, and inflation was roaring towards 15% a year. The big question on everyone's mind was, how in the world do you tame a beast like that?
Well, you do it by appointing a 6'7", cigar-chomping force of nature named Paul Volcker. And his prescription was as simple as it was brutal. He raised interest rates to an unbelievable 20%. One European leader famously said they were the highest rates since Jesus Christ. The economic pain across America was just immense. People lost their jobs, their farms, their homes. But it worked. Volcker broke the back of inflation, he stabilized the dollar, and in the process, he cemented the U.S. Federal Reserve's reputation as arguably the most powerful economic institution on the planet.
And that brings us right up to today. Because now, for the first time in almost a century, the dollar's absolute reign is no longer a given. We live in a multipolar world, and for the first time, the throne is under siege.
This chart here is fascinating because it basically shows you who holds the cards. When we talk about challenges to the dollar, we're really talking about these major players. Countries like China and Japan, the oil-rich Gulf states, the entire European bloc. They collectively hold trillions and trillions of US dollars. Now, that gives them incredible leverage and a massive stake in what happens to the dollar's value down the road.
And you know, the biggest rival to emerge has of course been the euro. But here's what's so interesting. It's a rival with a totally different philosophy. The dollar's ambition has always been described as kind of imperialistic. The goal was to be the world superpower currency. The people who created the euro, on the other hand, have always said things like, we don't want to govern the world. The euro wasn't created to kill the dollar. It was created to exist alongside it. That's a huge difference in mindset.
And this quote really just nails the whole situation. For about 100 years, the dollar has been on top for one very, very simple reason. There was no real competition. No other currency had the size, the stability, or the backing of an economy like the US. But with the rise of the euro, a powerful China, and other economic blocs, that has all now changed. The era of no competition is over. So, this is where we end up. For a century, the dollar's empire was just a fact of life, mainly because it had no real rivals. That is not the world we live in anymore. We're moving into a future with multiple centers of economic power. So the really big question for all of us in the 21st century isn't if this global financial order is going to change. It's what happens to the global economy and what happens to every single one of us when it does.